In 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed, killing 1,198 people. But for decades, the British government denied it was carrying weapons. Then in 2008, divers found 4 million rounds of ammunition in the wreck. They lied. This is the conspiracy that changed history. May 7, 1915. The RMS Lusitania was the pride of the Cunard Line, a floating palace of gilt and glass, carrying nearly 2,000 souls across the Atlantic, a cathedral of wealth and ambition, gliding through waters that had already swallowed hundreds of ships to German U-boats. But this wasn't just any passenger vessel. Beneath the polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers, in cargo holds sealed from prying eyes, something else traveled. Something the passengers would never know about. Something that would turn their luxury cruise into a coffin sinking at impossible speed. The morning air was thick with salt and diesel fumes. First-class passengers sipped champagne on the promenade deck, unaware that a German submarine commander was already tracking them through his periscope lens, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect angle of approach. Capit, Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, had been hunting for days. His orders were clear. Sink British vessels supporting the war effort. The Lusitania. She was technically a civilian ship. But in the fog of total war, those distinctions had begun to dissolve like sugar in blood, warm tea. At 12:10 p.m., a single torpedo struck the starboard side. One torpedo. Just one. What happened next defied every law of maritime disaster. The ship lurched violently. Then a second explosion, far more massive than the first, ripped through her hull like the fist of an angry god, punching through paper. The Lusitania didn't slowly settle into the waves, as ships were supposed to. She screamed. Metal shrieked against metal. Steam pipes burst with sounds like industrial banshees. The deck tilted at angles that sent grand pianos sliding through ballrooms, crushing passengers who thought they were safely gathering their life vests. 18 minutes. That's all it took for one of the largest, most modern ships in the world to vanish beneath the waves, taking 198 men, women, and children with her into the cold Atlantic darkness. But here's what haunts the cold water of history. A single torpedo shouldn't have done that. Naval architects studying the wreck couldn't explain the catastrophic second explosion. The ship's rapid, almost violent descent. The way she seemed to tear herself apart from within. And then there were the whispers. Whispers about secret cargo, about British intelligence knowing the route, about warnings ignored and escort ships mysteriously absent. Whispers that the Lusitania wasn't a victim of war. She was a sacrifice, a calculated offering to the gods of geopolitical strategy, her passengers unwitting martyrs in a scheme to drag America into a European bloodbath it desperately wanted to avoid. The official story would be written in ink and authority. But the truth floats in darker waters, waiting to surface like the bloated bodies that washed ashore for weeks after the sinking. This is the story they don't want you to examine too closely. This is the conspiracy that never quite drowns. What if 198 people died not in an act of war, but in an act of theater? Before the Lusitania ever left New York Harbor, death had already announced itself. On May 1, 1915, the German embassy placed an advertisement in 50 American newspapers, a stark, unambiguous warning printed right beside the Cunard Line's own sailing schedules, as if fate itself was offering passengers one final chance to reconsider their journey. Nantai travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists. Vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction. Most passengers laughed it off. A crude intimidation tactic, they said. German desperation. After all, no civilized nation would dare torpedo a passenger liner carrying American citizens. There were rules, conventions, the very fabric of maritime law stretching back centuries. But civilized nations had already been feeding their sons into industrial meat grinders for months, turning the fields of France into graveyards where the mud itself was mixed with human remains. Why would the ocean be any different? Captain William Turner received the warning too. Not just the public notice, but classified cables from the British Admiralty. Messages that should have routed his ship away from known U-boat hunting grounds, that should have assigned naval escorts, that should have told him to zigzag at full speed through the danger zone. Instead, the Admiralty's instructions were peculiar, vague, almost deliberately unhelpful. They told Turner to avoid headlands, areas close to shore, but the route they provided brought him directly along the Irish coast. They told him U-boats were active, but provided no specific coordinates. No destroyer escort was sent, despite multiple vessels being available at Queenstown, just hours away. Turner was sailing blind through wolf-infested waters with a bullseye painted on his ship's hull, and somewhere in London, men in dark suits were watching, waiting, calculating the political value of American outrage. Because here's what the passengers didn't know. The Lusitania was carrying more than wealthy tourists and immigrant families seeking new lives. Deep in her cargo holds, meticulously logged in shipping manifests that would later be sealed and classified for decades, were 200 cases of rifle cartridges, 250 cases of shrapnel shells, 18 cases of percussion fuses, over 170 tons of military munitions. This wasn't a passenger ship caught in the crossfire of war. This was a disguised ammunition transport hiding behind a human shield. A floating warehouse of death, wrapped in the veneer of civilian immunity. The German government knew it. British intelligence knew it. The question that echoes through history's cold corridors is this: did the passengers deserve to know they were cargo? The warning was there, printed in black and white, prophetic and precise. But prophecy only matters when people choose to listen, and someone, somewhere, needed them not to. The Lusitania's victims didn't board a death trap turn. They boarded a conspiracy that required their silence to succeed. A single torpedo struck at 2:10 p.m. Then came the second explosion. This is where the official narrative begins to fracture like glass under pressure, where physics and testimony collide in ways that suggest something far more sinister than simple wartime tragedy. Survivors described it with haunting consistency: a sharp impact, yes, but then something else, a massive, earth-shaking detonation from deep within the ship, far more powerful than the torpedo itself. The deck didn't just tilt. It buckled upward in places, as if invisible hands were tearing the Lusitania apart from her belly. Coal dust explosion, the British government claimed. But naval engineers studying the wreck couldn't make the math work. Coal dust explosions happen in mines, in confined spaces with perfect fuel-to-air ratios. Ships' boiler rooms are vented, damp, constantly monitored. The conditions weren't right, and the damage pattern was all wrong. When a torpedo strikes, It punches inward, metal crumples toward the point of impact. But forensic analysis of the wreckage showed sections of hull blown outward. Steel plates peeled away from the inside, twisted in directions that only make sense if the explosion originated within the cargo holds. Within the cargo holds where 170 tons of ammunition were stored. The British government maintained for decades that the munitions aboard were small arms ammunition, rifle cartridges, nothing that could cause a secondary explosion of such magnitude. But declassified documents, slowly released like confessions whispered from beyond the grave, told a different story. Explosives. High-grade military explosives. Gun cotton. Materials volatile enough to turn a passenger liner into a bomb if ignited properly, or if ignited deliberately. Because here's where the conspiracy deepens into something almost unbearable. British intelligence knew the Lusitania was a target. They had cracked German naval codes. They were reading U-boat communications in real time, tracking Schwieger's submarine like a hawk watching a mouse, knowing exactly where he was, where he would be. Yet no escort was sent. No warning reached Captain Turner in time. The ship sailed directly into the kill zone at reduced speed, practically gift, wrapped for destruction. And when the torpedo hit that cargo hold full of explosive materials, the Lusitania didn't just sink. She detonated. 18 minutes from impact to total submersion. Passengers had no time to reach lifeboats. No time to don life jackets properly. Children were still being dressed when the ship went under, their small bodies found weeks later, washed up on Irish beaches, still wearing the clothes their mothers had frantically pulled over their heads in those final, desperate moments. But the cold Atlantic doesn't forget, and neither do the questions that float in that darkness. Was the ammunition placed specifically to ensure catastrophic destruction? Was the Lusitania's rapid sinking not a tragedy of war, but a precisely calculated sacrifice designed to be so horrific, so unforgivable, that America would have no choice but to enter the conflict? The water keeps its secrets. But the metal remembers how it was torn. Captain William Turner survived. That itself is remarkable. The master of a ship is supposed to go down with his vessel. And Turner nearly did, swept under by the suction of the dying Lusitania, pulled into the freezing vortex that claimed so many others. But he surfaced. He lived, and in the weeks that followed, as the British government convened inquiries and hearings to determine what had gone wrong, Turner found himself in an impossible position, a scapegoat being carefully positioned for slaughter. The Mersey inquiry came swiftly, perhaps too swiftly. Lord Mersey, the presiding judge, had a reputation for thoroughness. But from the beginning, something felt choreographed about the proceedings. Questions were asked in ways that implied answers. Evidence was presented selectively. Crucial testimonies were taken in closed session, away from public scrutiny. Turner was grilled on his decisions. Why hadn't he zigzagged? Why was he so close to shore? Why had he reduced speed in a known danger zone? The captain's answers were consistent. He had followed Admiralty instructions. He had maintained the course they provided. The promised escort never arrived. The warnings he received were vague to the point of uselessness. But when Turner tried to introduce the Admiralty's communications into evidence, the documents were classified, sealed, removed from the record for reasons of national security. Lord Mersey himself would later express profound discomfort with the inquiry's conclusions. In private letters revealed decades after his death, he wrote of being pressured to reach predetermined findings, of government officials guiding his investigation away from certain questions, of evidence he was explicitly told not to examine. He resigned from all future maritime inquiries, a man who had overseen the investigations of the Titanic disaster, who had navigated the political complexities of that tragedy. Walked away from the Lusitania case, haunted. What had he seen in those sealed files? What truths had been whispered in closed chambers that made a distinguished jurist abandon his post, rather than continue participating in the charade? The official verdict blamed Turner's negligence. But Turner knew what he'd seen in those final hours before the torpedo struck. The absence of escorts that should have been there. The orders that made no tactical sense. The feeling that his ship was being deliberately positioned like a chess piece sacrificed to win a larger game. He carried that knowledge until his death in 1933, never speaking publicly about his suspicions, never writing his memoirs, living with the weight of 198 deaths and the cold certainty that someone, somewhere, had counted those lives as acceptable collateral. Because in the corridors of power, where wars are orchestrated, individual lives are numbers on spreadsheets, casualties are statistics, and tragedy is currency that can be spent to purchase political objectives. The Lusitania wasn't sunk by a German torpedo. It was drowned in calculation, and the man who knew the truth spent the rest of his life watching his back, wondering if silence was the only thing keeping him alive. The body count was barely tallied before the machinery of propaganda roared to life. Within hours of the sinking, newspaper headlines across America and Britain screamed of German barbarism, of U-boat commanders, laughing as women and children drowned, of civilization itself under assault by Teutonic savagery. Editorial cartoons depicted Kaiser Wilhelm as a blood-soaked monster. Recruitment posters appeared overnight, showing the Lusitania sinking in lurid detail, with slogans demanding vengeance. Public rallies spontaneously organized, perhaps too spontaneously, calling for immediate military intervention. The outrage was real, the grief was genuine, but the speed and coordination of the response, that suggested something else. Something planned. British intelligence had spent months cultivating relationships with American newspapers, feeding stories, shaping narratives. The "Remember the Lusitania" campaign didn't emerge organically from public sentiment. It was manufactured, refined, deployed with the precision of a military operation. Because Britain was losing the war. Not dramatically, but steadily, grinding toward a stalemate that would favor Germany's superior industrial capacity. British strategists knew they needed American intervention, American money, American troops, American industrial might to tip the balance. But America was isolationist, war-weary even before entering the conflict. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election on the promise of keeping the nation out of European entanglements. Public opinion was firmly against involvement, until the Lusitania. Suddenly, neutrality felt like cowardice. American citizens, 128 of them, had died in what was framed as an unprovoked attack on innocent civilians. The narrative was perfect, unassailable. Tragic enough to wound national pride, horrific enough to demand response. And it was a lie. Not the deaths. Those were horrifyingly real. Not the torpedo that struck exactly as reported. The lie was in the framing, in presenting the Lusitania as an innocent victim when she was, in fact, a military transport disguised as a civilian vessel. The lie was in the omissions. No major newspaper mentioned the ammunition in her hold. No official statement acknowledged that the ship was a legitimate military target under international law. The public was never told that Germany had explicitly warned passengers, that the embassy had taken out advertisements, that every precedent of maritime warfare gave boat commanders legal justification for the attack. Instead, the story became simple, digestible, emotionally overwhelming. Germany murders babies. And the American public, drowning in orchestrated grief, began to turn toward war. It would take 2 more years. 2 years of careful political maneuvering, of additional provocations, of slowly shifting public opinion, before American troops would actually deploy to Europe. But the Lusitania was the psychological turning point, the moment when intervention became not just possible, but inevitable. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, wrote in private correspondence, "The maneuver succeeded. It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope, especially of embroiling the United States with Germany." Read that sentence again. Attract neutral shipping in the hope of embroiling, not protect, not warn. Attract. Like bait placed carefully in waters where predators swim. The Lusitania's passengers weren't victims of war. They were actors in a theater they never knew existed, playing their final, fatal roles in a performance staged for an audience of millions, designed to make slaughter seem like salvation. For decades, the truth slept in locked archives, files stamped, classified, documents sealed for 30 years, then 50, then a century. Government officials citing national security, protecting sources and methods, maintaining the careful fiction that had been constructed around the Lusitania's grave. But secrets decay. And eventually, everything surfaces in 1972. A British arms dealer named Colin Simpson published a book claiming the Lusitania had been carrying massive quantities of explosives. Not just small arms ammunition, but high-grade military ordnance. He was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, his research attacked by historians who insisted the official story was accurate. Then the documents began to leak. Declassified manifests showing discrepancies in cargo listings. Sealed testimonies from Admiralty officials acknowledging they had tracked the German U-boat in real time. Internal memos discussing the strategic value of American outrage in the event of a civilian ship sinking. In 1982, a team of divers explored the wreck using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles. What they found in the debris field confirmed the worst suspicions, evidence of a massive internal explosion. Debris patterns consistent with high, explosive detonation, chemical signatures in the sediment that matched military-grade munitions. The British government moved quickly to seal the wreck site. Under the Protection of Military Remains Act, they declared the Lusitania a war grave, which meant diving on it without permission became a criminal offense. Officially, this was to respect the dead. Unofficially, it was to protect a century-old lie, but you can't seal history forever. In 2014, documents were released under the 100-year rule. Files that had been locked since 1914 finally opened to public scrutiny, and there, in faded ink and bureaucratic language, the conspiracy revealed itself. Winston Churchill had lobbied to ensure the Lusitania sailed without adequate protection. Room 40, the British Code, breaking unit, had intercepted and decoded German naval messages warning of U-boat activity in the exact area where the Lusitania would travel, and that intelligence was deliberately withheld from Captain Turner. Escort vessels stationed at Queenstown received orders to remain in port. The destroyer Juno, which could have reached the Lusitania within hours, was inexplicably recalled, just as the liner entered the danger zone. And perhaps most damningly, British officials had discussed, in writing, the political value of American casualties in swaying public opinion toward war. They had calculated, with cold precision, how many deaths would be necessary to justify intervention. One memo, written by a mid-level intelligence officer, contained a single chilling line. The loss must be severe enough to be unforgivable, but clean enough to be blamed entirely on German aggression. Translation: we need enough dead Americans to start a war, but not enough evidence of our complicity to undermine the narrative. The Lusitania's passengers were counted, assessed, and sacrificed. Their deaths were not tragic miscalculation. They were desired outcome. And the archives, finally forced open by time's relentless passage, whisper a truth that makes the cold Atlantic feel warm by comparison. Sometimes the monsters aren't the ones firing the torpedoes. They're the ones who position the target and call it strategy. But what if the conspiracy goes deeper still? What if the Lusitania wasn't just carrying explosives? What if it was carrying something even more dangerous? This is where historical fact gives way to speculation, where documented evidence dissolves into the realm of whispered theory and suppressed investigation. But in the shadow of what we already know, can we really dismiss any possibility as too dark to be true? Some researchers claim the cargo manifests show more than military munitions. Hidden in the deliberately vague listings, machinery parts, cheese, metals. There are anomalies, shipments with no clear origin, crates logged as agricultural supplies that weighed far more than their described contents. Cargo loaded in sealed containers under armed guard in the dead of night. Chemical weapons. That's the theory that haunts certain corners of historical research. That the Lusitania was transporting components for poison gas, chlorine phosgene, the very weapons that would turn World War I trenches into galleries of choking death. If that were true, if Germany discovered a British ship carrying chemical weapons under civilian cover, then the torpedo wasn't just justified, it was necessary. And the rapid sinking, the catastrophic explosion, the way the ship seemed to tear itself apart, that wasn't just ammunition cooking off. That was hell's own chemistry set detonating at the bottom of the Atlantic. The British government has never confirmed this theory. They've also never definitively disproven it, and their consistent refusal to allow comprehensive forensic examination of the wreck site raises questions that echo across a century of silence. Other theories spiral into even stranger territory. Some claim the Lusitania was carrying gold bullion, funding for covert operations, payment for American arms manufacturers, wealth that could finance entire campaigns. Divers reported seeing metallic debris in the cargo holds that matched neither military equipment nor passenger luggage. Still others suggest the ship was carrying intelligence documents, papers so sensitive that their discovery by Germany would have exposed the entire British spy network in neutral countries. Papers worth more than 1,000 lives. And then there's the darkest theory of all, that the Lusitania was deliberately loaded with volatile cargo and routed through danger waters, not to provoke Germany into an attack, but to ensure that when the attack came, there would be no survivors to tell the real story. Think about it. If the ship had been hit and slowly sunk, giving passengers time to evacuate properly, survivors would have had hours to see what was in those cargo holds, to witness military equipment being jettisoned, to understand they'd been sailing on a floating arsenal. But 18 minutes. 18 minutes of chaos and terror and drowning. No one had time to investigate. No one had time to question. They only had time to die, and the dead can't testify. The sea claimed them all. Passengers, secrets, evidence, swallowing everything into cold darkness where truth dissolves like salt. And somewhere, in offices far from the screaming and the drowning, men who orchestrated the sacrifice slept soundly, knowing that conspiracy is only conspiracy until the witnesses are silenced. Then it becomes history. Official, unquestionable, written by the victors who survived to hold the pen. The Lusitania lies 300 feet below the surface, 11 miles off the Old Head of Kinsale. A war grave. A crime scene. A monument to the price of empire and the mathematics of acceptable loss. Families of the dead never received full answers. They were given condolences, compensation payments, medals of honor. But never the truth, never the admission that their loved ones were chess pieces in a game where queens sacrifice pawns without hesitation or remorse. In the decades after the sinking, survivors carried their trauma like waterlogged cargo they couldn't unload. Children who watched their parents drown. Parents who lost children to the cold Atlantic. People who spent 18 minutes in hell and then a lifetime in the shadow of what they'd witnessed. They knew something was wrong. The way the ship went down. Too fast, too violent, too complete. The absence of naval protection. The vague warnings that seemed designed to be ignored rather than heeded. But who questions the architects of history when questioning itself feels like betraying the dead? So the truth was buried under layers of official narrative, under monuments and memorials that celebrated victims while hiding perpetrators, under 100-year classification rules that ensured anyone who might have been held accountable would be safely dead before the evidence emerged. The conspiracy succeeded. America entered World War I in 1917. British and American forces turned the tide. Germany was defeated. The victors wrote the history, and in that history, the Lusitania was simply a tragedy. An example of German barbarism. Not British calculation, but the water remembers. Divers who have descended to the wreck report strange feelings of unease, of being watched, of pressure that has nothing to do with depth. The ship itself seems to resist investigation, occurrence that shouldn't exist, equipment malfunctions, and almost deliberate concealment. As if the Lusitania herself has become guardian of her own secrets, protecting the truth from those who might disturb it, or warning investigators of what happens when you get too close to conspiracies that span continents and centuries, conspiracies willing to sacrifice nearly 1,200 lives without hesitation. Today, we know more than the passengers ever did. We have declassified documents, forensic evidence, testimony that was sealed for generations. We can trace the threads of decision making that led the Lusitania into harm's way, that loaded her with explosives, that positioned her perfectly for destruction. We can see the conspiracy, but we can't undo it. We can't resurrect the drowned, can't give back the stolen years, the unmourned deaths, the children who never grew old. We can't punish the architects who orchestrated the sacrifice. They died warm in their beds, honored and decorated. their reputations intact. All we can do is remember. Remember that history is written by those who control the narrative. That truth is often the first casualty of war. That governments will sacrifice their own citizens if the strategic calculus justifies the loss. The Lusitania's passengers boarded a ship thinking they were traveling to Liverpool. They were actually traveling to their own martyrdom. Unwitting volunteers in a conspiracy designed to change the course of a global conflict. And somewhere, in the cold dark 300 feet below the Atlantic surface, the wreck still holds its secrets, still cradles the bones of the betrayed, still asks the question that echoes across a century of conspiracy and cover-up. How many more Lusitanias are there? How many other tragedies were actually sacrifices? How many times have we mourned victims who were really casualties of calculations made in rooms we'll never enter, by people we'll never hold accountable? The water remembers. But do we?